Welcome back to the Sleep Code Historian. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Find your position, whether that's stretched out beneath a soft blanket, settled into a favorite chair, or somewhere quiet where the world outside has agreed, at least for now, to leave you alone. Take a slow breath in, let it out gently. There is nothing pressing, nothing urgent. The night is yours. Tonight, we continue the world's Silent Empire series. And this chapter takes us somewhere a little wilder than our last journey. We are leaving the monsoon merchants and the incense ports behind, at least for now, and sailing into darker waters. Tonight's story is called Pirates, Privateers, and the Business of Crime. It is a story about the sea, yes, about ships and swords and stolen gold. But it is also, and perhaps more surprisingly, a story about economics, about law, about the thin and often invisible line between what powerful people call crime and what they call commerce, depending on who is doing it and who is benefiting. It is a story full of remarkable human beings, sailors, outlaws, merchant princes, and kings, all navigating the same question that has never really gone away. Who gets to decide what counts as legitimate and what counts as theft? You don't need to follow every word. Let the voices of this history drift through you softly, the way the sound of distant waves drifts through an open window at night. Settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let the story carry you. Let's begin. For a long time, we've told the story of piracy as an adventure. Treasure maps and skull and crossbones flags. Swashbuckling heroes with names like Blackbeard and Calico Jack. Ships chasing ships across sparkling Caribbean water. It is one of the oldest and most beloved stories our culture tells. Romantic, dangerous, and safely confined to the distant past. But underneath that romance lies something more interesting and more unsettling. Pirates were not simply criminals who happened to operate at sea. They were, in many cases, the logical and predictable product of economic systems that created them, used them, discarded them, and then rewrote history to call them monsters. Marcus Rediker, one of the great historians of Atlantic piracy, argues that the pirates of the so-called Golden Age were not random villains. They were largely former merchant or naval sailors who had experienced the brutal working conditions of the early Atlantic economy and chose, at great personal risk, to opt out. They built their own societies on stolen ships, governed by codes of conduct that were, in some cases, more democratic and more humane than the vessels they had fled. Grease Lane, writing about the longer arc of piracy across the 16th through 18th centuries, shows us a world in which piracy was not a deviation from empire building, but a tool of it, used by European states, sanctioned by royal patents, and tolerated until it ceased to be useful. And Peter Earle, drawing on 250 years of Admiralty records, reminds us that the suppression of piracy was never simply a matter of law enforcement. It was a political project, driven by the changing commercial interests of powerful states. So here is the claim I want to make tonight, and let it drift quietly through your mind as you fall asleep. Piracy was not the opposite of legitimate commerce. For most of its history, it was commerce by other means, organized, financed, and tolerated by the same states and elites who eventually decided, when it suited them, to call it crime. Our story moves through three broad movements. First, violence as business. How piracy, privateering, and related forms of maritime crime were different organizational expressions of the same underlying economic logic, and how that logic was inseparable from the rise of Atlantic capitalism. Second, ports, plantations, and states. How the cities, elites, and governments of the Atlantic world profited from stolen goods, provided shelter to pirates, and only moved to criminalize them when piracy threatened larger commercial projects they cared about more. And third, the criminal life cycle, the arc from state sponsorship and tolerant neglect through the great boom years to the legal and military crackdowns that dismantled the piratical world and rendered its models obsolete. We'll move slowly. There is no rush. The sea is dark and quiet tonight, and we have all the time in the world. Let us begin at the beginning, or at least at the question that sits underneath everything else in this story. What exactly is the difference between a pirate and a merchant? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. A merchant trades. A pirate steals. One is legitimate, the other is criminal. One builds civilization, the other threatens it. But the further back you look, and the more carefully you examine the records that survive from the age of sail, the less obvious that distinction becomes. The early modern Atlantic economy was not a civilized marketplace suddenly disrupted by criminal predators. It was a violent scramble for resources, labor, and territory, conducted by states and merchants who were willing to use overwhelming force when they thought they could get away with it. The difference between a slaving expedition, a privateering voyage, and a piracy raid was often less a matter of moral principle than of paperwork, of whether someone with official authority had signed a document that authorized the violence in question. When that document existed, the violence was commerce. When it didn't, it was crime. Marcus Rediker frames this insight with characteristic precision. In Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, he traces the origins of Atlantic piracy to the labor conditions of merchant shipping in the early 18th century, and argues that what pirates built on their stolen ships was a deliberate inversion of the power relations they had fled. The floating democracies of the pirate companies, with their elected captains and their articles of agreement, were not romantic fantasy. They were a practical political response to the experience of working in one of the most exploitative labor environments in the early modern world, but to understand how that response was possible and why it took the specific forms it did, we need to understand the broader economic landscape of maritime violence first. But the story becomes more revealing when we look at the legal middle ground first. Begin with privateering, because privateering is where the story always begins when we try to understand the relationship between piracy and legitimate commerce. A privateer was, in the simplest terms, a privately owned armed ship that operated under government authority, a document called a letter of marque, to attack and seize the ships and goods of enemy nations. In wartime, this was legal. In peacetime, it was generally not. The distinction sounds clean until you try to apply it on the open ocean, far from any court, with prize goods in the hold, and a captain who may or may not have the most current intelligence about whether the two nations in question are technically at war this week. The practical reality of privateering was considerably messier than the legal theory suggested. Letters of marque were issued by governments who wanted the offensive capabilities of a naval fleet without the expense of maintaining one. The privateer captain provided his own ship, recruited his own crew, and financed his own operations. The government that issued the letter received a share of any prizes taken, valuable cargo, or ships captured from enemy vessels, and benefited from the military disruption caused to enemy shipping, all at minimal cost to the treasury. For the privateer captain, the incentives were straightforward. A successful voyage could yield enormous profits. A cargo ship intercepted in the right waters at the right time might carry more wealth than a successful merchant trading voyage of twice the length. And the risks, while real, were shared with crew members who had signed on knowing the nature of the enterprise. This was Increase Lane's analysis in Pillaging the Empire, the structural foundation of much of the Atlantic piracy that followed. Lane argues that the great privateering operations of the 16th century, English sea dogs like Francis Drake and John Hawkins operating against Spanish colonial trade, Dutch privateers terrorizing Iberian shipping, French corsairs raiding the treasure fleets, established patterns of organization, recruitment, and violence that became the templates for later unlicensed piracy. Drake himself is the perfect case study when he sailed into the harbor of Cartagena in 1586 and looted the Spanish colonial city, burning buildings, holding citizens for ransom, carrying away vast quantities of silver and goods. He was acting under royal commission. He was a privateer. His violence was commerce, authorized by Queen Elizabeth I, who received a portion of the proceeds. When a pirate captain entered the same harbor 20 years later without a letter of marque, he was a criminal. The act was nearly identical. The paperwork was different. Privateering represents the most formally organized end of the spectrum. At the other end lies a range of maritime behaviors that were criminal in law, but normalized in practice. Behaviors so widespread that they were arguably as important to the functioning of the early, modern Atlantic economy as legitimate trade. Barratry was the legal term for fraud by a ship's master against the ship's owners, deliberately wrecking the ship for insurance purposes, selling the cargo without the owner's knowledge, or otherwise using the ship for criminal purposes. It sounds like a narrow technical offense, but in the world of early modern maritime commerce, where ships were away for months or years, where communication was slow and verification nearly impossible, and where the temptation to betray a distant employer in favor of immediate profit was ever present, Barratry was common enough to be a persistent structural feature of the trade. Smuggling, which we might describe as trade conducted outside the official tax and regulatory frameworks of empire, was even more pervasive. The Spanish colonial system, which attempted to channel all trade between Spain and its American colonies through a handful of designated ports, with heavy duties paid at each point, created enormous and obvious incentives for smuggling. The gap between official prices and the prices available from Dutch, English, or French contraband traders was substantial. Local merchants, plantation owners, and even colonial officials participated routinely in illegal trade. Because official trade was too expensive, too slow, and too restricted to meet the actual needs of colonial economies, Lane's work on the Caribbean and Spanish Main shows in granular detail how the line between legitimate commerce and criminal contraband trade was drawn by Spanish imperial policy more than by any principle of economic or moral distinction. Dutch traders who sold cloth and tools to Spanish colonial planters were smugglers when those goods arrived without official Spanish documentation. The same goods, sold in the same transaction to the same buyer, would have been legitimate commerce if Spain had allowed Dutch merchants to hold trading licenses for its colonies. The crime was not in the object of the transaction, but in the regulatory framework through which it passed. And the enforcement of that framework was arbitrary, corrupt, and practically impossible. Colonial governors, who were supposed to suppress smuggling, often had personal financial interests in tolerating it. Local customs officials supplemented their meager official salaries with bribes from merchants who wanted their cargoes cleared without inspection. Contraband trade was so deeply woven into the fabric of colonial economic life that periodic crackdowns generally served more to extract money for the treasury than to actually suppress the trade. But privateering and smuggling, for all their importance, are not quite the same thing as what we usually mean when we talk about pirates, the golden age of Atlantic piracy. roughly the 1680s through the 1720s, produced something distinct: organized, self-governing communities of outlaws, operating on stolen ships under their own codes of law, attacking vessels of all nations without preference, and building a maritime subculture that Ridicker describes as a kind of floating alternative society. To understand where this came from, we have to understand what life was like for ordinary sailors in the Atlantic economy of the late 17th century. It was, by any honest measure, appalling. Merchant sailors of this period worked in conditions that combined physical danger, brutal discipline, low pay, and almost total legal vulnerability. A sailor who signed on for a voyage was effectively bound to the ship for the duration. He could not leave without the captain's permission, could not refuse work without risking severe punishment, and had virtually no legal recourse if the captain chose to withhold pay, impose brutal corporal punishment, or simply work men to death on a difficult passage. Ridicker documents in exhaustive detail the mortality rates of merchant shipping in this period. Death from accident, disease, and violence was common enough that crews signed on knowing they might not return. Yellow fever, dysentery, scurvy, and the routine hazards of working on a sailing ship in dangerous waters took a significant share of every crew on a long voyage. Captains who were too brutal or too careless about their crew's welfare faced the practical constraint that dead sailors couldn't work. But that constraint was loose enough to leave enormous room for cruelty. Naval service was, if anything, worse. Press gangs, legal under English law, could seize men off the street or out of taverns and force them into naval service at the king's wages, which were low and often unpaid for months at a time. The discipline of a naval vessel was more rigidly enforced than that of a merchant ship, with flogging for minor infractions. Desertion was punishable by death. The Navy was, for many sailors, less an employer than a form of institutional captivity. And then, at the end of wars, came demobilization. The great wars of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, required large naval forces and consequently large numbers of sailors. When those wars ended, the Navy discharged thousands of men into an Atlantic labor market that suddenly had more sailors than it needed ships. Pay fell. Working conditions, never good, deteriorated further as captains and owners took advantage of labor surplus to demand more and pay less. This is the immediate context for the explosion of Golden Age piracy after 1713. The year Queen Anne's War ended, and thousands of sailors found themselves unemployed, underpaid, and deeply familiar with what life on a well-organized ship could look like when it wasn't being run as a machine of exploitation. Some of them chose a different way. The ships that these men seized and operated were remarkable organizations. Ridicker's analysis of the Articles of Agreement, the written constitutions that pirate crews drew up when they formed or joined a company, reveals a set of governance arrangements that were, in their essentials, democratic in a way that would have been unthinkable on any legitimate vessel of the period. Captains were elected. They could be removed by majority vote. They held extraordinary authority in battle. The chaos of a naval engagement required decisive command. But in the ordinary business of running the ship, their authority was constrained by the crew's consent. Quartermasters, who managed the day-to-day operation of the ship, supervised the distribution of provisions, and adjudicated disputes among the crew, were separately elected and served as a check on the captain's power. This was a functional separation of powers in a floating polity, not a casual arrangement. Shares of prizes were distributed according to agreed formulas, published in the articles before the voyage began. Captains typically received a larger share, 2 portions, where a common sailor received 1, was a typical arrangement, but not the overwhelming differential that separated merchant captain from ordinary seaman in the legitimate trade. The distribution was not equal, but it was far more egalitarian than anything in the world these men had come from. Disability compensation was specified in many articles. A man who lost an eye or a limb in the company's service would receive a predetermined sum before any general division of prizes. This is, in effect, a workers' compensation system, and it predates anything like it in the legitimate maritime economy by many decades. The articles also typically specified recreational freedoms: the right to bring musical instruments aboard, rules about gambling and drinking that protected crew members from being cheated or impoverished by each other, provisions about the handling of women taken on prizes. None of this is to romanticize pirate life, which was brutal, dangerous, and short. Violence was endemic. The treatment of captured crews and passengers ranged from businesslike to sadistic. The liberty of the pirate ship was liberty for those who were part of the company, and the company's treatment of outsiders bore no resemblance to its internal democracy. But the internal organization is historically significant precisely because of what it reveals. These men knew how to build workable institutions of collective self-governance. They had the political imagination to conceive of a more equitable distribution of the proceeds of labor, and they were willing to risk death, which was the legal penalty for piracy throughout this period. For the experience of working in a community that treated them as something other than expendable, that is not a trivial fact. It tells us something important about what the legitimate world was offering them and why they found the offer insufficient. A single pirate ship operating alone in the open ocean is not a sustainable enterprise. Successful piracy required infrastructure, ports where ships could be careened and repaired, markets where stolen goods could be sold, financiers willing to provide capital and supplies in exchange for a share of the proceeds, and information networks that could identify valuable targets and safe passages. The Golden Age pirates built and exploited all of these. The most famous of the pirate bases, Nassau in the Bahamas, Tortuga in the Caribbean, St. Mary's Island off Madagascar, were not just convenient anchorages. They were nodes in a commercial network, providing the full range of services that a criminal enterprise at sea required. Nassau in the early 18th century was, for several years, effectively a pirate republic, a settlement whose economy was entirely organized around the support of piracy. Ships were careened on its beaches. Captured goods were sold in its markets. Taverns and lodging houses provided the services that sailors with money always seek, and the colonial government, such as it was, turned a blind eye, or more accurately, participated actively in the commerce of stolen goods. This was not unique to Nassau. The relationship between pirate operations and port economies was structural across the Atlantic world. Stolen goods, silks, spices, silver, cloth, provisions, entered legitimate commercial channels through fences and merchants, who purchased prize goods at significant discounts and resold them at a profit. These merchants were not peripheral figures in the economy. They were often respected members of colonial merchant communities, whose position allowed them to move stolen goods through official channels without attracting scrutiny. The financiers who outfitted pirate voyages were similarly embedded in legitimate commercial networks. A wealthy merchant who provided a ship's supplies in exchange for a guaranteed share of the next prize was not, in most cases, identifiable as a criminal. His investment was quiet, his profits were real, and his position in colonial society was secure enough that the authorities, if they were inclined to investigate, which they often were not, would struggle to find evidence of his involvement. Peter Earle's work on the British Admiralty records shows that these networks were well known to authorities, and that the failure to suppress them was, in many cases, a failure of, well, rather than a failure of knowledge. Governors who reported pirate activities to London often found themselves ignored or actively obstructed by colonial elites who had commercial reasons to prefer the status quo. The suppression of piracy was not a simple law enforcement problem. It was a political economy problem, a question of whose interests were served by toleration and whose were served by suppression. Understanding piracy as business also requires understanding how pirates chose their targets, because the logic of target selection tells us a great deal about the economic geography of the Atlantic world. Merchant shipping in the early Atlantic economy was concentrated along predictable routes, driven by the same seasonal winds and ocean currents that governed all sailing. The great treasure fleets that carried silver from the mines of Potosi in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico to Spanish ports in the Caribbean, and then across the Atlantic to Seville, followed routes that were well known to anyone who had sailed in those waters. The timing of their departure was governed by the hurricane season. The ports they used were few and identifiable. The vulnerability of these concentrations of wealth was obvious. Spanish colonial policy made matters worse from a security standpoint by mandating that trade between Spain and its American colonies pass through a small number of designated ports. Portobelo on the Isthmus of Panama, Cartagena on the Colombian coast, Vera Cruz on the Mexican Gulf Coast. At predictable times in the year, this consolidation of trade was designed to facilitate taxation and regulation. Its effect was also to concentrate enormous quantities of valuable goods in predictable places at predictable times, creating targets so attractive that they were almost irresistible to anyone with a fast ship and a willingness to use force. The East Indiamen, the great ships of the Dutch and English East India companies, carrying spices, silks, and ceramics from Asia to European markets, were similarly predictable in their routes and their timing, though they were more heavily armed and harder to take. The pirates who operated in the Red Sea and off the Indian Ocean coasts at the end of the 17th century, figures like Henry Every and the young William Kidd, were targeting these ships and the pilgrim vessels that traveled the same routes. Pirate intelligence about ship movements came from multiple sources. Sailors who had worked the merchant routes knew where valuable cargoes could be found, and when tavern conversations in port cities were notoriously loose, and merchant captains who discussed their upcoming voyages in public company might find that information had reached unfriendly ears before they cleared the harbor. Informants within port facilities, dock workers, pilots, customs officials could be bribed or persuaded to share information about departing vessels and their cargoes. The decision about which vessels to attack was also shaped by a calculation of risk. A heavily armed convoy was a different proposition from a lone merchantman in an isolated stretch of water. Pirates with fast, maneuverable ships could choose their moments, approaching under a false flag, delaying attack until conditions were favorable, avoiding engagements where the target's defensive armament made success uncertain, and the aftermath of a successful raid was itself a commercial operation. Valuable cargo had to be moved to markets. Ships taken as prizes could be kept, sold, or stripped of useful equipment and sunk. Surviving crew members had to be decided upon, released, pressed into service, with the pirate company, or in some cases harmed. These decisions were not always made with calculation. Rage, cruelty, and the chaos of violence all played roles, but they were also economic decisions, shaped by the cost of keeping prisoners, the value of skilled sailors, and the reputational consequences for future encounters of being known as a company that treated surrendered crews with particular brutality or particular mercy. But beneath the individual raids, something larger was driving the entire system. There is a deeper argument lurking beneath all of this, and it is worth stating it plainly before we move on. The violence of piracy was not an aberration from the violence of legitimate maritime commerce. It was an extension of it. The Atlantic economy of the 17th and 18th centuries was built on coercion at every level. The labor that produced its most valuable commodities, sugar, tobacco, cotton, and eventually rice, was enslaved labor, extracted under constant threat of violence from human beings who had been kidnapped, transported across the ocean in conditions of appalling brutality, and subjected to legal regimes that treated them as property rather than persons. The slave trade itself, perhaps the single most economically important maritime activity in the Atlantic during this period, was an organized system of kidnapping and transportation conducted under the flag of merchant companies, licensed by governments, and celebrated in the financial centers of London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon as a legitimate commercial enterprise. The ships that carried enslaved Africans to the Americas were heavily armed. The mortality on those voyages was horrifying. The violence required to maintain the system, to capture people in Africa, to hold them on ships, to discipline them on plantations, was continuous, systematic, and entirely legal. Ridicker, whose later work, The Slave Ship, extends his analysis of Atlantic maritime labor into the specific history of the slave trade, makes the uncomfortable observation that the same ocean, the same ships, and in some cases, the same men participated in both the slave trade and piracy, sometimes sequentially, sometimes simultaneously. The violence was distributed differently across these different enterprises, and the legal status of each was different. But the underlying logic, the use of force to extract value from people or goods, was shared. This does not excuse pirate violence or minimize its real harms, but it does place that violence in a context that makes its origins comprehensible. When the state sanctioned and profited from one form of maritime violence and condemned and executed practitioners of another, the line between the two was drawn by political economy, not by any principled distinction between peaceful and violent commerce. The pirates of the Golden Age understood this, at least intuitively. Their declarations and songs, when they survive, often invoke the hypocrisy of a world that hanged men for theft while tolerating and depending upon the vastly larger theft of enslaved human beings. Whether those invocations were sincere or self-serving, they identified something real about the moral landscape of the world they inhabited. Let us return to privateering with fresh eyes, because the more you look at it, the more clearly it illustrates the argument we've been building. Privateering was not simply a wartime convenience, a way of supplementing naval power when budgets were tight. It was, at certain moments, a central instrument of national economic strategy. The Elizabethan sea dogs, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, Raleigh, were privateers in the sense that they operated under royal patents, but they were also instruments of a deliberate policy of economic warfare against Spain, designed to disrupt Spanish imperial trade and finance in ways that would simultaneously weaken England's primary rival and enrich the English investors who financed the voyages. Queen Elizabeth invested directly in Drake's circumnavigation. The voyage of 1577 to 1580 that saw the Golden Hind sail around the world, raiding Spanish ports and ships along the way. Her investment was secret because the official position of the English government was that it was not at war with Spain, and that Drake's activities were therefore, from a strict legal standpoint, piracy. The diplomatic fiction was maintained. When Spain complained about Drake's raids, Elizabeth expressed official disapproval while privately celebrating his return and his proceeds. The Queen's share of the profits from Drake's circumnavigation, estimated at something like £160,000, equivalent to perhaps tens of millions of modern pounds, was enough to pay off the entire national debt and still leave a surplus for investment. This is not the picture of a state reluctantly tolerating private crime. This is the state as silent partner in organized maritime predation, hiding behind diplomatic fictions while profiting directly from the violence. The Dutch Republic operated the same system on an even larger scale during its long struggle against Spanish imperial dominance in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Dutch privateers, operating initially under letters of marque issued by the Prince of Orange, and later under the authority of the Dutch States General, systematically targeted Spanish and Portuguese shipping across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. The wealth extracted from this campaign helped finance the Dutch commercial expansion that would make the Dutch Republic the dominant commercial power of the 17th century. The line between state-sponsored privateering and the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, which we discussed in our last journey, was not as sharp as the formal categories suggest. The VOC was, from its founding, armed with the power to make war, seize ships, and establish territorial control wherever it found it commercially advantageous to do so. Its legal status was different from that of a privateer operating under a letter of marque, but its practical methods, armed ships, coerced trade, the use of violence to eliminate competition, were recognizably continuous with the privateering tradition, one of the most striking features of Golden Age piracy, and one that Ridicker emphasizes strongly, is the degree to which pirates articulated their own moral framework for what they were doing. They were not, for the most part, simple criminals who had simply decided that property norms didn't apply to them. They had a specific complaint: that the legitimate economy was rigged, that the law protected the wealthy at the expense of the poor, and that their own violence was a response to, rather than a departure from, the violence of the system they had rejected. This moral framework manifested in several characteristic ways. Pirates frequently made a point of treating the ordinary sailors of ships they captured with relative generosity, while reserving special treatment, often brutal, for captains and officers who had reputations for abusing their crews. This was not always consistent, and stories of pirate cruelty toward all on board were also common. But the pattern was identifiable enough to be documented in multiple sources. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the Golden Age, was said to have allowed captured crews to vote on whether they wished to join his company, and to have welcomed those who did with genuine hospitality. The articles of pirate companies typically forbade the taking of women by force, a provision that reflected both a pragmatic concern about conflict within the company and a genuine, if imperfect, moral principle about the limits of violence. Some pirates explicitly claimed to be conducting economic redistribution, taking from the rich in the form of merchant ship owners and their valuable cargoes, and returning value to the dispossessed. Workers of the sea, historians are rightly cautious about taking such claims at face value, since self-justification is always available to those who want it. But the fact that these justifications were made, and that they resonated with enough people to form the basis of song, legend, and oral tradition, tells us something about the moral landscape of the world in which piracy flourished. The most famous expression of this moral framework is perhaps the speech attributed to Samuel Bellamy. Black Sam Bellamy, a young English pirate who operated in the Caribbean and Atlantic in 1716 and 1717, before his ship was wrecked in a storm off Cape Cod. Bellamy reportedly told a captured merchant captain, "You are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security." Whether those exact words were spoken is uncertain. They come to us through the filter of a later account whose accuracy is disputed, but the sentiment they express, that piracy was a rational response to a legal and economic system designed to benefit the already powerful, was genuine and widespread among the men who chose that life, it does not make them heroes, but it does make them comprehensible. Beyond the individual ship and crew, Golden Age piracy developed organizational forms that allowed for coordination, mutual defense, and collective action. What we might, in modern terms, call confederations or networks, the pirates who operated out of Nassau in the Bahamas in the early 18th century were not an undifferentiated mass of independent actors. They were a community with shared norms, overlapping social networks, and some capacity for coordinated action. Ships that met at sea would exchange information about patrol routes, profitable hunting grounds, and dangerous areas. Crews from different ships shared meals and recreation in port. Men transferred between ships as opportunities arose, building relationships that spread across multiple vessels. This social network had practical consequences. A pirate captain who needed a larger crew for a particular target could recruit from the shared pool of sailors at Nassau or another base. A ship that needed repairs might find assistance from another company's crew in exchange for future reciprocity. Information about naval deployments, crucial for avoiding the anti-piracy patrols that became increasingly serious after 1717, circulated through the network. The Confederation was not a formal organization with a hierarchy and a treasury. It was a network of relationships, sustained by mutual interest and shared identity, capable of generating coordinated responses to external threats, even without central direction. This organizational form was both a strength and a weakness. It was resilient. Attacking the network at any single point didn't destroy it, because there was no single point to attack. But it was also incapable of the kind of sustained strategic coordination that would have been required to resist a determined, well-organized state suppression campaign. When the British government finally decided in the late 1710s and 1720s to make the suppression of Caribbean piracy a genuine priority, the Confederate network was vulnerable in ways that a more formally organized structure might not have been. We move now from the ships to the shore, from the men who committed the acts of piracy to the men, and occasionally women, who made those acts economically viable by providing the infrastructure they required. The ports, the markets, the financial networks, the political protection, because piracy, like any business, required a supply chain. Ships needed careening, the periodic process of beaching a vessel and cleaning and repairing its hull, which was necessary for maintaining speed and preventing the rot and marine growth that would eventually destroy any wooden hull. They needed provisions, food, water, powder, and shot. They needed places to sell their prizes and the goods those prizes carried. And they needed, perhaps most of all political environments, in which the risk of capture and prosecution was low enough to make the enterprise worthwhile. All of these requirements connected the world of piracy to the world of legitimate commerce and colonial governance in ways that made the two almost impossible to cleanly separate. And once we move from the ships to the shore, the pattern becomes even clearer. The most direct form of official complicity in piracy was the tolerance, and sometimes the active encouragement of pirate operations by colonial governors who benefited personally or whose economies depended on the commerce that pirates brought. The most notorious example is New York in the 1690s, under Governor Benjamin Fletcher, who served as colonial governor of New York from 1692 to 1698. The city became the primary American base for pirates operating in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Fletcher openly welcomed pirate captains, accepted bribes, issued dubious trading licenses that provided legal cover for ships that intended to engage in piracy, and allowed pirate crews to spend freely in the cities, taverns, and markets. The economic logic was simple. New York in the 1690s was a relatively small colonial city, competing with other colonial ports for trade and revenue. The pirates who used New York as a base brought substantial cash. Profits from raids on Indian Ocean shipping were paid in gold and silver, which were chronically scarce in colonial economies that ran on credit and commodity exchange. That cash circulated through the local economy, enriching tavern keepers, merchants, and anyone else who could attract pirate custom. Fletcher was not unusual in his willingness to make this bargain. Governors across the Caribbean and American colonies operated in political environments where the pressure from local commercial interests to tolerate piracy was often stronger than the pressure from London to suppress it. The colonies were far from England. Communication was slow. The merchants who profited from pirate commerce were present, visible, and politically influential. The Admiralty officials who wanted piracy suppressed were distant and theoretical. Lane's work on Spanish colonial piracy shows a similar pattern on the other side of the Atlantic economy. Spanish colonial officials, who were supposed to enforce the exclusive trading monopolies of the Crown, regularly tolerated or participated in contraband trade with Dutch, English, and French smugglers because the official trade was inadequate to supply colonial needs, and because the personal profits from unofficial tolerance were substantial. This was not simple corruption in the sense of individual officials breaking clearly understood rules for personal gain. It was a systemic feature of colonial governance, a recognition that the formal rules of imperial trade policy were impossible to enforce without local cooperation, and that local cooperation was only available at a price below the level of official governance. The integration of piracy into legitimate commercial networks operated through the figure of the merchant fence, the established, respected businessman who purchased stolen goods and moved them into legitimate commercial channels. The economics of fencing pirate prize goods were attractive. A merchant who could purchase cargo at the deep discounts that pirates were willing to accept. Since their primary goal was converting goods to cash quickly, without the capacity or the time to hold out for better prices, could then sell those goods at market rates, realizing substantial margins on each transaction. The risks were manageable, especially in colonial ports where the authorities were sympathetic or bribable, and where the volume of goods moving through the market made any particular consignment difficult to trace. In the absence of sophisticated record-keeping, customs documentation, or regular audit processes, there was very little practical mechanism for identifying stolen goods once they had passed through a single layer of commercial transactions. Merchants who participated in this trade were not, in most cases, primarily pirates' agents. They were opportunists, businessmen who added stolen goods to their regular commercial activities when the opportunity arose, and the risk seemed acceptable. The moral calculus they applied was not dramatically different from that of any businessman in an environment where the line between legal and illegal commerce was blurry. Enforcement was sporadic, and the official trading system was widely regarded as serving the interests of distant imperial powers rather than local needs. The goods that passed through these networks ranged from the mundane to the spectacular. Ordinary commodities, provisions, cloth, tools, hardware, were the bread and butter of pirate prizes because they were easy to sell, and there was always demand. High-value luxury goods, spices, silks, porcelain, silver, commanded higher prices, but required more careful handling, since they were more distinctive and more likely to attract attention if their provenance was questioned. The most valuable prizes of all were the great hauls from major attacks on treasure ships or East Indiamen, the silver bullion from Spanish colonial trade, the spice cargoes from the Indian Ocean route. These required the most sophisticated commercial networks to move, and their movement left the most traces in the historical record. The episode that most clearly illustrates the political economy of official tolerance and its limits is the story of the Red Sea Men, the pirates who operated out of Madagascar and other Indian Ocean bases at the end of the 17th century, attacking the ships of the Mughal Empire and the English East India Company. The Red Sea Men included some of the most famous names in pirate history. Henry Every, also known as Long Ben Avery, who in 1695 captured the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb's ship Ganjai Sawai in one of the most profitable pirate raids ever recorded. Thomas Tew, a Rhode Island privateer who turned pirate and made multiple voyages to the Red Sea. And William Kidd, Captain Kidd, a New York merchant and privateer, whose case became one of the defining legal and political controversies of the age. What makes the Red Sea episode so historically illuminating is the way it illustrates the political mechanism by which piracy shifted from tolerated enterprise to prosecuted crime. For most of the 1690s, the pirate operations based in Madagascar and operating in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean were tolerated by American colonial authorities for the same reasons that Caribbean piracy was tolerated. The money was welcome. The merchants who profited from it were influential, and the costs paid by Indian and East Indian Company merchants rather than by colonial Americans were borne by people who were far away and politically powerless in the colonial context. The East India Company, however, was not a powerless actor in London. It was one of the most influential commercial entities in England, with shareholders who included members of Parliament, government ministers, and major investors who had the ear of the king when the company's ships were attacked, and when the Mughal emperor, furious about the pirate depredations on his subjects' shipping, threatened to expel English merchants from India entirely. The company brought its political weight to bear in London. The result was a fundamental shift in official policy. The English government, which had been content to ignore the Red Sea pirates as long as their victims were foreigners, and their profits stayed in English colonial pockets, suddenly found that the cost of continued toleration was the loss of the Indian Ocean trade, one of the most profitable commercial relationships in the English commercial world. Captain Kidd's story is the most famous casualty of this shift. Kidd had been commissioned as a privateer in 1695, with backing from a group of aristocratic investors that included the Earl of Bellamont, who was simultaneously appointed as governor of New York with a brief to suppress piracy. The commission charged Kidd with attacking pirate vessels and French ships. What happened next is disputed. Kidd's defenders argue that he was largely operating within his commission. His prosecutors argued that he had turned pirate himself. What is not disputed is the political context of his trial. When Kidd returned to the American colonies in 1699, hoping to negotiate his situation, he found that the political winds had shifted entirely. His aristocratic backers, embarrassed by the political controversy and unwilling to be associated with a man now labeled a pirate, abandoned him. He was arrested, shipped to England, and hanged at Execution Dock in 1701. His conviction and the very public manner of his execution. His body was displayed in a gibbet at the Thames estuary as a warning to sailors, was not simply a matter of legal justice. It was a political statement that the age of tolerating piracy in the Indian Ocean trade was over, and that the commercial interests of the East India Company would be protected regardless of the inconvenience to colonial merchants who had previously found pirates profitable. The relationship between piracy and the plantation economies of the Caribbean and American colonies was more structural than the simple exchange of stolen goods for local currency. Pirate ships needed provisions, food, water, rum, tobacco, in large quantities. The agricultural surplus of Caribbean and American colonies, which produced substantial quantities of these commodities for export, was perfectly positioned to supply that demand. Planters who sold provisions to pirate ships were participating in a form of commerce that was, strictly speaking, illegal, but that was also economically rational and practically difficult to distinguish from legitimate provisioning trade. The ships that supplied pirate bases at Tortuga, Nassau, and Madagascar were not always obviously criminal enterprises. A vessel carrying provisions from a Jamaican plantation to an anchorage in the Bahamas might have entirely legitimate reasons for being where it was, and the captain might have been instructed by the plantation owner to make no inquiry about the identity of the buyers. This web of agricultural supply relationships embedded piracy in the physical landscape of the colonial economy in ways that made it genuinely difficult to suppress, even when officials were so inclined. The same plantations, the same merchants, and the same ships that supplied legitimate trading vessels also supplied pirate ships, because the market for provisions didn't inquire too closely into its customers' credentials. The enslaved labor that produced those provisions is also relevant here. Ridicker and other historians have noted the complex relationship between piracy and slavery in the Atlantic world. Some pirate companies included formerly enslaved people among their crew, men who had seized the opportunity of a pirate raid on the ship, carrying them to escape enslavement, or who had been freed from plantation slavery and found their way to pirate ships. The pirate articles of some companies specified that formerly enslaved members of the crew were to be treated as full members of the company, entitled to equal shares. This was not a universal practice, and many pirate companies captured and sold enslaved people as readily as any other cargo. But the presence of formerly enslaved members in some pirate companies and the occasional rescue of enslaved people from ships or plantations by pirate companies added another dimension to the moral complexity of the pirate world. If colonial elites profited from piracy, and if colonial governments tolerated it, the obvious question is why that tolerance eventually ended. Why, after decades of looking the other way, did the British government mount the sustained anti-piracy campaign of the 1710s and 1720s that effectively ended the Golden Age? The answer, as Guy Chet argues in his analysis of maritime law and the politics of piracy suppression is that suppression became politically viable and commercially necessary. When piracy began to threaten interests that were more important to metropolitan commercial elites than the revenues from stolen goods, several factors converged in the years after the end of Queen Anne's War in 1713. First, the scale of piracy had grown to the point where it was seriously disrupting legitimate Atlantic trade. The volume of ships attacked and the value of goods taken had reached levels where the costs to London merchants were becoming politically intolerable. A certain level of piracy could be absorbed as a cost of doing business. The level that prevailed in the late 1710s was exceeding that threshold. Second, the development of more regular and systematic Atlantic trade routes. Part of the broader commercialization and rationalization of Atlantic commerce in this period made predictability and security more valuable. Merchants who were building long-term commercial relationships, extending credit across multiple seasons, and planning voyages with precise timing could not easily absorb the disruption of piracy. The ad hoc, opportunistic character of earlier colonial commerce had been more compatible with tolerating piracy than the more sophisticated commercial structures of the 1710s. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the specific targets of Golden Age pirates had shifted in ways that brought the interests of powerful metropolitan merchants directly into conflict with continued tolerance. Caribbean pirates, who had previously focused on Spanish shipping, were now attacking English merchant vessels as readily as any other. This was, for the English commercial establishment, a different kind of problem than attacks on foreign shipping. It was now their own trade that was being disrupted, their own merchants who were losing ships and cargoes. The response, the appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of Nassau in 1718, the proclamation of pardon for pirates who surrendered, and the vigorous naval campaign against those who refused, was neither inevitable nor uncontested. Colonial merchants who had profited from piracy did not simply welcome the new order. There were political struggles within colonial societies about the terms of suppression, the distribution of costs, and the legitimacy of metropolitan authority to impose commercial order on communities that had found their own piracy-friendly arrangements satisfactory. But the outcome was determined by the balance of metropolitan and colonial commercial interests, a balance that, by 1720, had shifted decisively against the pirates and against the coastal elites who had sheltered them. We cannot discuss the relationship between states, elites, and maritime violence without returning, briefly, to the chartered companies, the Dutch VOC and the English East India Company, that we encountered in our last journey, because these institutions represent the fullest expression of the argument that violence and commerce were not opposites in the early modern maritime world, but different modes of the same underlying practice. The East India Companies were, to repeat the essential point, private commercial enterprises granted by their respective governments the legal power to make war, sign treaties, seize territory, and use force against anyone who competed with their commercial monopolies. They exercised those powers extensively, routinely, and without the kind of legal accountability that the concept of criminal justice implies. The VOC's treatment of the spice-producing populations of the Banda Islands, extermination, in the literal sense, of a population that refused to accept monopoly terms, was organized and deliberate. It was also entirely legal under the VOC's charter. The violence was commercial, the commerce was violent, and the legal framework that distinguished this from piracy was the piece of paper that said the VOC had the authority to do what it did. The English East India Company was similarly free with violence when it served commercial purposes. The bombardment of coastal towns, the seizure of Mogul ships to force commercial concessions, the use of military power to establish monopolistic trading relationships with rulers who might have preferred other options. All of these were standard commercial tools for the company, conducted under the authority of a royal charter that made them, in the eyes of English law, legitimate. The pirates who attacked East Indiamen were criminals. The East India Companies that monopolized whole oceans were corporations. The difference was authorization, not method. And this is where piracy stops being only a story of ships and becomes a story of rise and decline. Having traced the economic logic of maritime violence and the complicity of elites and states in sustaining it, we turn now to the longer arc, the life cycle of piracy as a historical phenomenon, from its origins in state-sponsored violence through its golden age, and into the period of systematic suppression that brought the great age of Atlantic piracy to an end. This life cycle is not unique to piracy. It follows a pattern that historians have identified in many other relationships between states and the violence they need, but are ultimately unwilling to permanently authorize. In the beginning, the state creates or tolerates the violent actor because it is useful, because the violence serves state interests at lower cost than state provision of equivalent force. In the middle period, the violent actor achieves independence and scale, operating for its own benefit as much as the state's, and becoming difficult to control. At the end, the state decides that the costs of continued tolerance outweigh the benefits, and launches a suppression campaign that criminalizes what was previously permitted or ignored. The pirates of the Atlantic Golden Age did not emerge from nowhere. They were, in significant part, the creation of state policies that had cultivated maritime violence for state purposes, and then abandoned the people trained in that violence when their services were no longer needed. The first phase of the piracy life cycle spans roughly 2 centuries, from the beginning of sustained European expansion into the Atlantic and the Caribbean to the end of the 17th century. During this period, European states, primarily England, France, the Dutch Republic, and to a lesser extent Denmark and Sweden, used licensed maritime violence as a central instrument of their competition with each other and with the dominant Iberian powers. The privateering enterprises of this period were not marginal or tolerated but frowned upon activities. They were crown-sponsored operations, financed by aristocratic investors, celebrated in popular culture, and incorporated into the national narratives of the states that conducted them. Drake's circumnavigation and his raids on Spanish colonial ports were celebrated in English culture as national heroism. His return to England in 1580 was a public triumph. His knighthood by Elizabeth, a formal acknowledgement of state approval. The violence he had committed against Spanish ships, ports, and subjects was reframed as patriotic service, as justified response to Spanish imperial aggression rather than criminal predation. This reframing was not entirely dishonest. England and Spain were engaged in a genuine political and commercial conflict, and Drake's operations were a form of unconventional warfare conducted in the service of recognizable national interests. But the celebration of his violence also served to normalize maritime predation as a legitimate career path for English sailors and a legitimate source of national wealth. That normalization had long-lasting consequences. It established the cultural template that later generations of sailors would draw on when they considered the option of abandoning legitimate service for the pirate life. If Drake could be a national hero for doing essentially what a pirate did, the moral distinction between authorized and unauthorized maritime violence was not as stark as the law claimed. Lane's analysis of Spanish colonial piracy in the 16th century shows the same dynamics from the Spanish perspective. The initial wave of piracy against Spanish colonial shipping was conducted primarily by French corsairs in the 1520s and 1530s, operating under license from the French crown in the context of the ongoing Franco-Spanish conflict. Their operations were commerce raiding in the military sense, disrupting the flow of colonial wealth to the Spanish treasury, as well as straightforward robbery. The Spanish response was to build stronger convoys and better fortifications, not to challenge the legitimacy of the French licensing arrangement, because Spain ran its own system of licensed privateering when it found that useful. The English sea dogs of the later 16th century, Hawkins, Drake, Raleigh, were operating in this established tradition, extending and amplifying it in ways that would reshape the Atlantic political economy for a century. The buccaneers represent a crucial transition in the life cycle of Atlantic piracy. The moment when the relationship between state-licensed violence and freelance maritime crime became genuinely ambiguous and difficult to disentangle. The buccaneers originated as a population of French, English, and Dutch hunters and settlers on the western coast of Hispaniola, who were violently expelled from their settlements by Spanish colonial authorities in the 1620s and 1630s, driven to the small island of Tortuga off the northern coast of Hispaniola. They organized themselves into a community of survivors who preyed on Spanish shipping, partly from necessity, partly from vengeance, and partly because the opportunity was there. The French, English, and Dutch governments, who were variously at war and at peace with Spain during this period, found the buccaneers useful. When at war, they issued letters of marque that licensed buccaneer operations against Spanish shipping. When at peace, they issued proclamations condemning buccaneer activities that they made little effort to enforce. The buccaneers themselves moved fluidly between licensed and unlicensed operations, often operating under letters of marque of doubtful validity or antique date, taking prizes that their authorizations may not technically have covered. The most famous of the buccaneers, Henry Morgan, who sacked the city of Panama in 1671 in the most ambitious buccaneer operation ever conducted, was at various times a licensed privateer, an unlicensed raider, a prisoner of the English crown, and eventually the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Morgan's trajectory illustrates the full ambiguity of the buccaneer position. He conducted operations of breathtaking audacity and violence against Spanish colonial targets, enriching himself and his crews and his English investors. He was briefly imprisoned when his sack of Panama provoked diplomatic protests from Spain, but was quickly released and rewarded with his governorship when the political calculation shifted. He spent his later years in Jamaica as a wealthy, respected member of colonial society, suppressing the very kind of piracy that had made his fortune. The buccaneers were not simply proto-pirates waiting to be criminalized. They were a specific response to specific political and economic conditions. The conflict between European states for control of the Caribbean, the vulnerability of Spanish colonial shipping, and the availability of large numbers of displaced, armed, and experienced maritime fighters who had no stake in the official order, and every reason to challenge it. When those conditions changed, when the major European powers reached more stable accommodations with Spain and with each other, when the Caribbean political map solidified into more established colonial arrangements, the buccaneer model became less useful to states and more threatening emerging legitimate commercial order. The transition from buccaneer to pirate was not a single moment. It was a gradual shift in political designation. The same men doing similar things being reclassified as state interests changed from irregular warriors to criminals. But the famous names emerged from very specific circumstances. The golden age of Atlantic piracy, the period that produced Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Samuel Bellamy, Charles Vane, and dozens of other names, was created by a specific historical conjuncture that is worth understanding carefully. The period from 1689 to 1713 saw two major wars, King William's War and Queen Anne's War, that mobilized large numbers of English and colonial sailors in naval service and in privateering. These wars created a generation of men with maritime skills, experience of armed ships, and relatively democratic expectations about the conditions under which they were willing to work. They had been part of privateering enterprises where the gains from prize-taking were shared relatively broadly. They had experienced something approaching the collegiality of pirate organizations when the wars ended, and especially when Queen Anne's War ended in 1713. These men were discharged into an Atlantic labor market that had more sailors than it needed and offered the survivors of wartime service the choice between brutal merchant or naval conditions and unemployment. The demobilization of 1713 was, Riddicker argues, the proximate cause of the piracy explosion that followed. The key figures of the Golden Age emerged from this context. Blackbeard Edward Teach, or Thatch, was probably a former privateer who turned pirate after the end of Queen Anne's War. Bartholomew Roberts, perhaps the most successful Golden Age pirate in terms of ships taken and wealth accumulated, had been the second mate of a slave ship when his vessel was captured by pirates. He joined the pirates, apparently by choice, and rose through the company to become captain. Charles Vane and Calico Jack Rackham were part of the Nassau pirate community, which for several years in the 1710s made the Bahamas effectively a pirate republic. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two of the handful of women who appear prominently in the historical record of Golden Age piracy, were both associated with Rackham's ship, and their stories raise questions about gender, identity, and the degree to which the pirate community could accommodate people who did not fit conventional social roles. The geography of Golden Age piracy was not confined to the Caribbean. Pirate operations in this period ranged across the Atlantic, from the American colonial coast to the coast of West Africa, from the Caribbean to the waters around Newfoundland. The Indian Ocean trade routes, which had been targeted by an earlier generation of pirates in the 1690s, remained a zone of pirate activity. The routes along which valuable commodities moved were were the routes along which pirates operated. Since their success depended on the same commercial geography that organized legitimate trade, one of the most distinctive features of Golden Age piracy is its theatrical quality, the deliberate performance of terror as a commercial strategy. The skull and crossbones flag, the Jolly Roger, was not simply a symbol of defiance. It was a business tool designed to communicate to potential prey the identity of the approaching ship and the consequences of resistance. A merchant captain who recognized the Jolly Roger on an approaching vessel faced a clear choice: resist and risk a violent engagement whose outcome was uncertain, or surrender and face the consequences of being taken. Pirates cultivated reputations for violence because those reputations were commercially valuable. A pirate company with a well-established reputation for brutality toward those who resisted and relative generosity toward those who surrendered quickly could take prizes without fighting, simply by making the cost of resistance clearly higher than the cost of compliance. Every prize taken without violence was a prize taken more cheaply and safely. This is the logic behind some of the more spectacular behaviors attributed to figures like Blackbeard. The stories of Blackbeard setting his beard alight with slow-burning fuses to create an eerie, smoke-wreathed appearance during an engagement, of his practice of cutting off fingers or ears of captured merchants who seemed reluctant to hand over valuables, of his various entertainments with captive passengers. These are not simply evidence of sadism or madness. They are evidence of a calculated performance of terrifying unpredictability, designed to reinforce the rational calculation that surrender was better than resistance. The flag system of Golden Age pirates was itself more elaborate than the simple skull and crossbones suggests. Different captains flew different variations. Some added hourglasses, representing time running out. Some added skeletal figures. Some added bloody hearts. These variations were known enough that a merchant captain who recognized a specific flag might know the specific pirate company approaching, with its specific reputation for how it treated prey that surrendered versus prey that resisted. This is branding in the commercial sense, the creation of a recognizable identity in a competitive marketplace, designed to shape customer behavior. The customers in this case were unwilling, and the transaction was forced. But the logic of reputation management, audience targeting, and behavioral influence was the same logic that any commercial enterprise applies. The transition from toleration to suppression was not simply a matter of deploying warships. It required a legal architecture, a set of statutes, judicial procedures, and international agreements that defined piracy as a universal crime, removed it from the ambiguities of national jurisdiction, and made its prosecution possible across the multiple legal environments of the Atlantic world. The key legal development was the establishment of piracy as a crime under international law. What lawyers call hostes humani generis, the enemies of all mankind. This concept, developed by English and Dutch jurists in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, held that pirates, unlike ordinary criminals, could be tried and executed by any nation's courts without the usual requirement that the crime have taken place within that nation's jurisdiction. This was legally important because it addressed one of the practical obstacles to piracy suppression: the problem of jurisdiction. A pirate who attacked an English merchant ship in Caribbean waters was captured by a Dutch naval vessel and brought to a French colonial port for trial, faced a genuinely complex legal situation in which no single nation had obvious authority to prosecute. The host's humani generis doctrine cut through these complications by declaring pirates to be outside the protection of any nation's law, subject to trial and execution by whoever caught them. Guy Chet's analysis of anti-piracy law as political instrument shows that this legal architecture was not simply a neutral response to the legal challenges posed by piracy. It was a tool of commercial policy designed to facilitate the suppression of activities that had become inconvenient to metropolitan commercial interests, while not disturbing the other forms of maritime violence: privateering, colonial enforcement, slave trading, that those interests still found useful. The selective application of the law was itself a form of legal propaganda, defining as crime the violence of the dispossessed, while continuing to authorize the violence of the privileged, and calling the distinction a principle of law rather than a calculation of power. The Piracy Act of 1717, which established a system of admiralty courts in colonial ports, able to try piracy cases without a jury, was a particularly significant piece of this architecture. The removal of the jury was not accidental. Juries in colonial ports were notoriously unwilling to convict pirates because juries were drawn from communities that contained many people who had profited from piracy or sympathized with pirates, or both. The Admiralty Court system bypassed this resistance by removing the decision from the community and placing it with appointed officials who were more reliably aligned with metropolitan commercial interests. And now the crackdown begins in earnest. The practical suppression of Caribbean piracy began in earnest with the appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas in 1718. Rogers was an ideal instrument for the policy the British government now wanted to implement. He was a former privateer himself. He had led a privateering expedition around the world in 1711, rescuing Alexander Selkirk from the island of Juan Fernandez. In the process, Selkirk's story became the basis for Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. He knew the culture and the people of the maritime world intimately. He understood what would attract former pirates to the offered amnesty and what would drive them back into resistance. His approach combined carrot and stick in carefully calibrated proportions. The carrot was the royal pardon, formally offered in 1717. It promised immunity from prosecution for all past acts of piracy to pirates who surrendered by a specified date. The terms were generous enough that a significant number of pirates chose to accept, exchanging the risks and rigors of pirate life for the chance to return to legitimate existence. The stick was a naval force, backed by clear orders to hang those who refused the pardon. Rogers arrived at Nassau with a small fleet and immediately set about establishing a government capable of actually enforcing the pardon's conditions. Pirates who had accepted the pardon and then returned to piracy, the most famous of whom was Charles Vane, who had refused the pardon and fled before Rogers arrived, were hunted down and, when caught, hanged. The most public demonstration of the new order was the execution of 8 former pirates at Nassau in 1718. Shortly after Rogers' arrival, the executions were conducted with deliberate ceremony. Rogers attended in person. The condemned were given time to speak. The bodies were displayed on gibbets in the harbor, where all arriving ships could see them. This was theater in the same sense that pirate violence was theater. A performance designed to communicate clear information about the consequences of noncompliance. The campaign was not immediately or uniformly successful. Several of the most significant Golden Age pirates, Bartholomew Roberts, Edward England, John Taylor, continued to operate for several more years after the Nassau campaign began. Roberts, in particular, proved extraordinarily difficult to catch, operating along the West African coast and in the Caribbean until his death in battle with a Royal Navy vessel in 1722. But the trend was clear. The combined effect of naval patrols, legal changes that made prosecution easier and conviction more certain, and the gradual erosion of the shoreside support networks that had sustained piracy, as colonial elites who had previously tolerated or encouraged piracy found it politically safer and commercially wiser to cooperate with suppression, made the Golden Age unsustainable. By the mid-1720s, the great wave of Atlantic piracy had effectively broken. The names that the Golden Age produced, Blackbeard, Roberts, Bellamy, Vane, were already becoming legends, their stories entering the popular culture in ways that began the process of transformation from dangerous criminals to romantic heroes. But even after the ships were gone, the pirate story kept sailing on. The transformation of pirates from criminals to romantic figures began almost immediately after the Golden Age ended. tells us something important about the cultural functions that the pirate story serves. Daniel Defoe, writing under the pseudonym Captain Charles Johnson, published a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates in 1724, just as the Golden Age was concluding. This book is the primary source for much of what we think we know about Golden Age pirates, and it is a work of remarkable ambiguity, part factual account, part moralizing condemnation, part barely disguised celebration of the very figures it nominally deplores. Johnson's pirates are criminals who meet their deserved ends on the gallows, but they are also, in his telling, vivid, larger-than-life characters whose audacity and defiance of authority give them a kind of heroic stature. The speech attributed to Bartholomew Roberts, "A merry life and a short one shall be my motto." The portrait of Blackbeard as a figure of terrifying and almost supernatural force. The ambiguous presentation of Mary Read and Anne Bonny as women who had exchanged female powerlessness for pirate liberty. All of these elements work to make pirates admirable, even in the context of their condemnation. This ambivalence in the primary source is the foundation on which 2 centuries of romantic piracy mythology have been built. By the 19th century, pirates had become the subject of popular novels, stage plays, and operatic treatments. Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance, which premiered in 1879, represents the full transformation of the pirate from dangerous criminal to comic opera buffoon, still transgressive enough to be interesting, but safely domesticated enough to be entertaining for respectable Victorian audiences. The romantic pirate, free, defiant, governed by his own code rather than the laws, has never lost its cultural appeal. It recurs in every generation of popular culture, from the swashbuckling pirates of classic Hollywood cinema to the modern pirates of the Caribbean franchise. The story always contains the same core elements: a protagonist who rejects the corruptions of legitimate authority, finds freedom on the open sea, and operates by a personal code that is, in some ways, more honest and more principled than the official morality he has rejected. What is lost in this romantic version, what the romance actively obscures, is the economic and social context that Ridicker and Lane and the other historians of this period have spent their careers recovering. The romantic pirate is an individual. The historical pirate was a product of systems. The romantic pirate embodies freedom. The historical pirate embodied specific, structured forms of resistance to specific, structured forms of exploitation. The romantic pirate is outside history. The historical pirate is deeply, inextricably within it. The suppression of Atlantic Golden Age piracy in the 1720s did not end piracy as a global phenomenon. It ended a specific, historically bounded form of piracy, the organized, self-governing pirate companies of the early 18th century Atlantic. By destroying the political and economic conditions that had made that form possible, other forms of maritime predation continued in other oceans and under other conditions. The Barbary corsairs of the Mediterranean continued their operations until the 1830s, when French conquest of Algeria and American naval action against Tripoli and Algiers effectively ended the corsair economy of North Africa. Their suppression, as noted earlier, came not from any principled commitment to the elimination of maritime violence, but from the changed military balance between European states and the North African principalities, and from the end of the diplomatic arrangements under which European states had tolerated corsair operations against rival nations' shipping. Chinese piracy in the South China Sea reached its greatest scale in the early 19th century, a period coinciding with the disruption of traditional commercial and social orders by the expansion of European commercial power in Asian waters. The confederation led by Chiang Ai-sao, a remarkable woman who commanded a pirate confederation of perhaps 50,000 sailors and hundreds of ships at its peak, represents one of the largest pirate organizations in history, controlling large sections of the South China coast and forcing both the Chinese imperial government and European traders to negotiate with it on something approaching equal terms. Chiang Ai-sao's eventual retirement, negotiated with the Chinese government, who offered terms rather than attempt a military suppression they weren't confident of winning, represents a different resolution of the state piracy relationship than the Atlantic pattern. Rather than being destroyed by military force, her confederation was demobilized by negotiation, with former pirates offered legitimate commercial opportunities that made continued piracy less attractive than peaceful commerce. This negotiated resolution points toward a structural truth about the history of piracy that the romantic version tends to obscure. The boundary between piracy and legitimate commerce was always permeable in both directions. Pirates could, and sometimes did, become merchants when the conditions for legitimate commerce became sufficiently attractive. The pirates who accepted the Woodes-Rogers amnesty became, in some cases, successful colonial merchants. Chiang Ai-sao became a respectable gambling house owner. The transition was possible because the skills, the networks, and the capital of piracy were not so different from those of legitimate maritime commerce that the crossing was inherently impossible. The story of piracy does not end in the 18th or 19th century. It continues in modified form in the present. But the story does not end with the 18th century. Before we continue, a gentle reminder that you are listening to the Sleep Code Historian. By the early 18th century, The great pirate fleets of the Atlantic had largely disappeared. Governments had hunted them down. Trade routes were more tightly controlled, and the golden age of piracy slowly faded into history. But the forces that created pirates never truly vanished. Global trade continued to move enormous wealth across the oceans, and wherever wealth travels across open water, the temptation to seize it often follows. Centuries after Blackbeard and Anne Bonny sailed the Caribbean, piracy would appear again in new forms and new regions of the world. Modern maritime piracy is, like its historical predecessors, a product of specific economic and political conditions. Poverty, state failure, and the vulnerability of commercial shipping in specific geographic zones. The piracy off the Somali coast that attracted intense international attention in the late 2000s and early 2010s had explicit structural similarities to the Golden Age Atlantic pattern. Somali fishermen, whose traditional livelihoods had been disrupted by the collapse of the Somali state and by illegal foreign fishing in Somali coastal waters, turned to raiding commercial ships as an alternative economic strategy. The targets they chose: slow-moving bulk carriers and container ships passing through the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, following the same routes that medieval dhow merchants had used, were vulnerable because commercial shipping was inadequately defended. The economic logic of the modern pirate confederations was recognizably similar to that of their historical predecessors. They built organizational structures that distributed risk and reward, recruited labor from the pool of young men in a failed state economy who had few other options, and built relationships with shoreside networks that could supply provisions, ransom negotiations, and financial services. The response of the international community, naval patrols, legal cooperation, armed guards on commercial vessels, and economic development programs designed to provide alternative livelihoods for young men in coastal Somalia, drew on the same mix of suppression and accommodation that had characterized historical responses to piracy. The decline of Somali piracy after roughly 2012 was driven by the armed guards strategy more than by naval patrols, replicating, in a modern context, the pattern by which individual merchants had historically protected themselves through defensive measures when state protection was unavailable. Modern piracy in the Strait of Malacca, in the waters of West Africa, and in various other geographic zones, continues to illustrate the enduring relationship between maritime predation and the structural conditions that make it viable. Poverty, state weakness, geographic vulnerability, and the concentration of valuable commercial traffic in predictable locations. The fundamental logic has not changed in 500 years. The golden age of Atlantic piracy is associated, in popular imagination, almost exclusively with men. historical record preserves the stories of at least two women, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who participated in piracy on something approaching equal terms with their male shipmates, and whose stories complicate any simple narrative about the relationship between piracy and gender. Anne Bonny was the illegitimate daughter of an Irish lawyer who had emigrated to South Carolina. She married a sailor named James Bonny, apparently against her father's wishes, and eventually left him for the pirate Captain John Rackham, known as Calico Jack for his preference for colorful cotton clothing. She joined Rackham's pirate company, apparently wearing men's clothing at least some of the time, and was present on the ship when it was captured by a Jamaican government sloop in 1720. Mary Read's earlier history is more obscure and perhaps more embellished. The primary source, Captain Johnson's General History, attributes to her a remarkable early life in which she served as a soldier in the Low Countries while disguised as a man, before eventually finding herself on Rackham's ship. The details of Johnson's account are impossible to verify, but the core fact of her presence on the ship is attested by the records of her trial. At the trial, both women were convicted of piracy and sentenced to death. Both claimed to be pregnant, a legal maneuver that postponed execution pending the birth of the child. Mary Read died in prison, probably of fever. Anne Bonny's ultimate fate is not recorded. She may have been pardoned or may have died in prison as well. What is historically significant about their story is not the romantic version, which tends to celebrate them as swashbuckling adventuresses, free women of the sea, but what it reveals about the possibilities and limits of the pirate world's alternative social arrangements. The pirate ship's internal democracy and relative egalitarianism were genuinely remarkable by the standards of the time, but they were also substantially limited to the community of men who comprised the formal crew. The pirate articles that specified equal shares, disability compensation, and democratic governance were written by and for men. They did not, as far as the historical record shows, anticipate or accommodate female crew members. Bonny and Read occupied an ambiguous position within the company. Present, apparently active, reportedly among the few on the ship who continued to fight when it was taken, while much of the male crew were below decks in a drunken stupor. The famous comment attributed to Anne Bonny at Rackham's sentencing, that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog, reflects, if authentic, both her contempt for his failure of courage and her own identification with the ethos of pirate defiance. Their stories also raise questions about the relationship between piracy and gender performance. The practice of women passing as men in military and maritime contexts was more common in this period than is often recognized. The barriers were social and legal rather than technical. and a woman who could perform the physical work, present a convincing masculine appearance, and maintain the necessary social performance, could and did serve on ships and in armies. The pirate world, which was already outside the law in every other respect, may have been somewhat less rigidly policed in this dimension than legitimate maritime society. But it was not a feminist utopia. The treatment of women taken as prizes, the violent sexual exploitation that was a feature of many pirate raids, regardless of what the articles might specify about force, is part of the same historical record and deserves the same honest acknowledgement. The story of Golden Age Atlantic piracy does not exhaust the history of maritime violence in the early modern period. The Indian Ocean, whose longer commercial history we explored in our last journey, had its own complex relationship with piracy, privateering, and maritime crime that both paralleled and diverged from the Atlantic pattern. The pirates who operated out of Madagascar and other Indian Ocean bases at the end of the 17th century, the Red Sea men we discussed earlier, were largely Atlantic-trained sailors who had extended the Atlantic piracy model into a new ocean. Their operations against Mogul and East India Company shipping shared the organizational forms and commercial logic of their Atlantic counterparts, but they were operating in a commercial environment that was, in important respects, different from the Caribbean. The Indian Ocean trade routes they were attacking had been functioning for centuries before European arrival. The merchants and shippers whose goods they took were not abstract commercial interests. They were real merchants, many of them from Muslim communities that had deep roots in the ocean's commercial life, whose livelihoods were being disrupted in ways that had immediate political consequences. The attack on the Ganjai Sawai, the great Mogul ship taken by Henry Every in 1695, resulting in the rape and murder of a substantial number of its passengers and crew, was not simply a commercial crime. It was an act of violence against the subjects of one of the most powerful empires in the world, conducted in a context where the English East India Company's ability to do business in India depended on maintaining the goodwill of the Mughal court. Every's raid and the failure of English authorities to adequately prosecute him nearly destroyed the company's position in India. This is why the Red Sea episode produced such a sharp legal and political response. Sharper than the comparable Caribbean piracy had yet produced. The stakes were simply higher. The Indian Ocean trade was more valuable. The political consequences of allowing piracy to continue were more immediate, and the power of the commercial interests who stood to lose from continued tolerance was greater in London than the colonial interests who profited from it. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb's response to Every's raid, seizing East India Company employees in India, threatening to expel the company from the subcontinent, made clear that the consequences of inadequate piracy suppression could extend far beyond the value of individual prizes. The political economy of the Indian Ocean, in which European commercial success depended on the tolerance of powerful Asian states, created a different set of constraints on official toleration of piracy than existed in the Caribbean, where the most powerful political actors were European colonial powers, who were often themselves complicit in the trade. The East Asian dimensions of maritime violence in this period are equally significant and are brought into the story in Lane's revised edition of Pillaging the Empire, Chinese and Japanese maritime history in the 16th and 17th centuries includes extensive piracy, known in Chinese sources as Waku raids, conducted primarily by Japanese and Chinese maritime actors in the waters of the South China Sea and the Japanese island chain. The Waku phenomenon was, in important respects, a product of the same kind of policy-created vulnerability that drove Atlantic piracy, Chinese imperial trade restrictions, the Heijin or sea ban, that periodically prohibited Chinese subjects from engaging in maritime trade, created enormous economic incentives for smuggling and piracy, since the demand for foreign goods did not disappear simply because the state had prohibited the trade. Merchants who wanted to trade in the prohibited goods and sailors who needed to make a living found themselves operating outside the law by the simple fact of participating in commerce that the state had decided to prohibit. The Waku were not simply Japanese raiders attacking Chinese coastal communities, though the most virulent periods of Waku activity did involve significant violence against coastal populations. They were a complex social phenomenon involving Chinese merchants, Japanese sailors, and traders of multiple other origins, operating in a gray zone between prohibited commerce and outright piracy. The political and moral categories, legitimate trade, smuggling, piracy, were applied to these activities by Chinese imperial authorities according to criteria that had as much to do with political convenience as with any principled distinction between acceptable and unacceptable maritime activity. We've established that pirates required shoreside support, and that colonial merchants and governors often provided it. But the relationship between port cities and piracy goes deeper than simple complicity. In some cases, the economies of port cities were structured in ways that made piracy tolerance not just profitable, but almost inevitable. Consider the specific economic geography of the early Atlantic world. The great plantation economies of the Caribbean, producing sugar, tobacco, and indigo, were by far the most economically important parts of the English and French colonial systems. The island colonies of Barbados, Jamaica, and later, the Leeward Islands, generated more value for the metropolitan economy than all of the continental North American colonies combined. But these plantation economies were structurally dependent on imports of almost everything their enslaved and free populations consumed. Food, since the land that might have grown provisions was devoted to the more profitable cash crops. Clothing and textiles, hardware and tools, animals for work and consumption, building materials, all of this had to be imported because the plantation model had made self-sufficiency impossible. The official trade system, regulated by the Navigation Acts that required English colonial goods to be carried on English ships to English ports, and foreign goods to pay substantial duties, was expensive and slow. The Atlantic was full of Dutch, French, and other merchants who could supply the same goods more cheaply, more quickly, and without the regulatory overhead and the goods that pirates brought to colonial markets, seized from ships of all nations, sold at the steep discounts that characterized any forced commercial transaction, were cheaper still. In this context, a colonial governor or merchant community that refused to buy pirate goods was not merely foregoing a commercial opportunity. It was potentially imposing significant costs on the plantation economy. Higher prices for essential imports, slower supply chains, a disadvantage relative to competing colonies that were less scrupulous about their suppliers' credentials. The structural logic of the plantation economy thus created persistent incentives for tolerance of pirate commerce, even among people who might have had no particular moral sympathy for pirates themselves. It was less a matter of criminal conspiracy than of economic rationality operating within a structure that made criminality rational. Jamaica is the clearest case. Throughout the second half of the 17th century, Jamaica's economy was intimately connected to the buccaneer and pirate networks that used Port Royal as their primary base. Port Royal, a crowded, prosperous, somewhat notorious trading city, was the commercial hub through which pirate prizes entered the Jamaican and Atlantic economy. Its merchants bought prize goods. Its taverns and lodging houses served pirate crews. Its craftsmen repaired pirate ships. Its population of perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 in the 1680s included a disproportionate number of people whose livelihoods were directly or indirectly dependent on the commerce that piracy generated. The famous destruction of Port Royal by earthquake in 1692, which killed a significant fraction of the city's population and permanently altered the physical landscape of the harbor, was interpreted by many contemporaries as divine judgment on a city of exceptional wickedness. The Puritan clergy of New England were particularly vocal in this interpretation, whether or not one accepts the divine judgment framing. The earthquake did have significant economic consequences for the Jamaican piracy nexus. disrupting the commercial infrastructure that had sustained it. The question of who financed pirate voyages is one of the more obscure and historically significant aspects of the piracy business. The romantic image of the pirate captain as a self-made entrepreneur who seized his first ship through audacity alone obscures the reality that maritime enterprise, even criminal maritime enterprise, required capital. Ships needed to be provisioned. Weapons and powder needed to be purchased or stolen. Crews needed advance wages in some form before they would sign articles, and the prizes that a pirate ship sought to take were not guaranteed. The voyage might find slim pickings for months before encountering a valuable target, and the ship and crew had to survive the lean period. The evidence for merchant financing of pirate voyages is necessarily fragmentary. People who were committing crimes by providing such financing had strong incentives to keep their involvement invisible, but the historical record contains enough examples, direct and indirect, to establish that private financing of piracy was a real and significant phenomenon. In the most straightforward cases, colonial merchants supplied pirate ships with provisions and equipment on terms that amounted to a commercial investment in the voyage. A prearranged share of the prizes in exchange for the supplies and services provided. The transaction was nominally a sale or a loan, but the terms made it a commercial partnership. More subtly, merchants who purchased pirate prize goods were providing the capital that made continued piracy viable, converting the proceeds of one voyage into the funds that could finance the next. Without buyers for stolen goods, pirates could not convert their prizes into the cash they needed for wages, provisions, and equipment. The merchant fence was, in this sense, as important to the sustainability of piracy as the pirate captain himself. At the upper end of the financing relationship, we have the examples we've already discussed. The aristocratic investors who backed legitimized piracy in the form of privateering and who slipped between sanctioned and unsanctioned operations as conditions changed. The men who financed Drake's circumnavigation were engaging in a form of venture capital investment in maritime predation, sanctioned by royal commission, but operating at the edge of what that commission technically authorized. The financing relationships also explain some of the patterns of pirate behavior that might otherwise seem puzzling. A pirate company that was operating with the quiet backing of colonial merchants had interests in protecting those backers from exposure, attacking only foreign ships, avoiding certain ports, maintaining relationships with particular colonial officials. A company that had no such backing was freer in its targets, but also more vulnerable in its need for shoreside support. We touched earlier on the importance of commercial intelligence to pirate operations, but the scale and sophistication of the information networks that Golden Age pirates developed deserve more detailed attention. The challenge for a pirate captain planning a cruise was, at its core, an information problem. The Atlantic Ocean is large. Merchant shipping moves continuously in multiple directions. The window for intercepting a specific valuable target, a treasure ship leaving Havana, a slave ship returning to Europe with the proceeds of a cargo sale, might be narrow, and naval patrols, which were becoming more organized and more effective as the anti-piracy campaign progressed, represented a genuine threat that intelligent planning could reduce. The information that pirates needed came from multiple sources, some passive and some actively cultivated. The tavern culture of Atlantic port cities was an important passive source. Sailors who had worked legitimate routes talked freely about cargoes they had carried, routes they had sailed, harbors where particular types of vessels were expected. This information circulated through the tavern networks of Nassau, Tortuga, and the smaller anchorages where pirates gathered, and a captain who listened carefully and cultivated the right social relationships could accumulate a significant intelligence picture. More active information gathering came through the systematic interrogation of captured sailors and merchants. When a pirate ship took a prize, the crew's first priority after securing the vessel was often to question those on board about other ships they had recently encountered, cargoes they knew to be at sea, patrol routes of naval vessels, and conditions in ports they had recently left. This debriefing of captives was a standard part of pirate operational practice, and some captives, particularly those who were subsequently offered the chance to join the pirate company, might be motivated to share everything they knew. Former privateers and naval sailors who joined pirate companies brought with them detailed knowledge of official naval operations, patrol schedules, communication protocols, the locations and capacities of naval bases. This knowledge was invaluable for avoiding the anti-piracy patrols that became increasingly serious after 1717, and it helps explain why experienced naval and privateer sailors were such desirable recruits for pirate companies. Networks of informants in port cities, dock workers, pilots, customs officials, tavern employees could be cultivated with small payments or shared loyalties. A pirate captain who had spent time in a particular colonial port and built relationships there had access to a flow of commercially valuable intelligence that his competitors lacked. The information networks of Golden Age piracy were not simply opportunistic. They were a structured component of the pirate business model, as necessary to commercial success as fast ships, experienced crews, and knowledge of the sailing routes. One of the aspects of the piracy business that receives insufficient attention in popular accounts is the ransom trade, the practice of holding captives for payment. Ransom was a standard feature of maritime violence in multiple contexts. The Barbary corsairs of the Mediterranean built much of their economy on it, enslaving European sailors and coastal inhabitants, and then holding them for ransom, or selling them into labor in North African households and galleys, redeeming enslaved Europeans from Barbary captivity, was a major organized charity enterprise in Catholic Europe, with religious orders like the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians raising funds specifically for this purpose. In the Atlantic context, ransom was most commonly applied to the wealthy passengers and the important officials who might be found on the more valuable prizes. A Spanish colonial official traveling back to Spain with personal wealth accumulated during his term of service. A wealthy merchant traveling with valuable papers. A ship's captain who might be worth ransoming to his owners. These were potential ransom subjects whose value as paying captives exceeded their value as potential crew recruits or ordinary prisoners. The negotiation of ransoms was a commercial transaction conducted through intermediaries and according to informal but reasonably well understood rules. The captive or his family agreed to pay a specified sum, delivered through a neutral third party, in exchange for safe return. Both sides had incentives to reach agreement. The captor wanted the money, and the captive wanted his freedom. The transaction required trust in the absence of any legal mechanism for enforcement. The pirate had to believe that the ransom would actually be delivered, and the captive had to believe that payment would actually result in release. This trust was sustained by reputation. Pirates who violated ransom agreements found subsequent negotiations more difficult, while those with reputations for honoring their terms could extract ransom more reliably and at higher prices. The ransom trade had an additional commercial dimension in the form of the hostage prize. The practice of holding not just individuals, but entire ships and their cargoes, until a ransom equivalent to the cargo's value was paid by the owners. This was more common in Mediterranean corsair operations than in Atlantic piracy, but it appears in Atlantic contexts as well, and it illustrates the degree to which the commercial logic of maritime violence extended well beyond simple theft. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, as he was known, died in battle off the West African coast in February 1722, when the Royal Navy warship HMS Swallow caught his ship at anchor, with much of the crew incapacitated by the previous night's drinking. The engagement was brief. Roberts was killed by grape shot early in the fight, and most of his crew surrendered. The subsequent trial at Cape Corso Castle on the West African coast was one of the largest piracy trials in history. Over 200 men were tried. More than 50 were executed. The rest received varying sentences: transportation, imprisonment, or acquittal for those who could convincingly argue they had been forced into piracy against their will. The trial record is a remarkable document. It reveals, in the defendant's own statements and in the testimony of witnesses, the texture of life on a golden age pirate ship in its final years. Roberts had been an extraordinarily successful captain. His company had taken over 400 vessels in 3 years of operation, ranging across the Atlantic from Brazil to Newfoundland to West Africa. His articles were among the most fully developed and formally articulated of any surviving pirate code. His company had its own administrative structure, its own internal legal procedures for adjudicating disputes, and a shared culture of professional pride that comes through clearly in the trial testimony. The testimony also reveals the degree to which the distinction between voluntary and involuntary membership in a pirate company was genuinely complicated. Many of the defendants claimed to have been forced to join Roberts' crew after their ships were taken as prizes. Some of these claims were clearly true. The articles themselves specified that men who had been forced to serve could not be held to the same obligations as voluntary members. Some were clearly false. Men who had been enthusiastic members of the company, attempting to escape punishment through the legal fiction of compulsion. But the harder cases, men who had joined voluntarily in a moment of desperation or resentment, who had neither sought nor resisted the invitation, who had participated in the company's operations without any particular conviction, revealed how thin the line between forced and voluntary membership could be in a world where legitimate options were so constrained. The executions that followed the trial were conducted with the same deliberate ceremony that characterized all public piracy executions of the period. The bodies of the executed were hung in gibbets at Cape Corso Castle, where passing ships could see them as a warning. The choice of location was carefully considered. This was a major hub of the West African slave trade, and the display of hanged pirates was a message to the sailors of the slave ships that the protection of their trade was now a priority of the British state. The timing of Robert's death and the Cape Corso trial effectively ended the Golden Age. There were subsequent pirate operations, later incidents in the Caribbean and elsewhere, but they never achieved the scale, the organizational sophistication, or the cultural resonance of the great Golden Age companies. The conditions that had created those companies, the mass demobilization of 1713, the inadequate response of early suppression efforts, the tolerance of colonial ports, had been substantially changed by the Woodes-Rogers campaign and the naval acts, and they were not recreated. One of the most counterintuitive legacies of the Golden Age pirates is their contribution to the development of democratic practices in governance. This claim requires qualification. The pirates were not political theorists. Their articles of agreement were not philosophical treatises. They were practical documents, hammered out by communities of men who needed workable rules for sharing both the risks and the rewards of their enterprise. But the practices those documents established elected captains, proportional share distribution, disability compensation, limits on the captain's authority outside of battle conditions, were remarkably sophisticated institutional arrangements for organizations that were, by definition, excluded from the formal legal and political institutions of their time. Ridicker draws a parallel between the pirate company and the contemporary political theories of writers like John Locke, who argued that legitimate government required the consent of the governed and was subject to removal when it failed to protect the interests of the community. The pirates did not read Locke, but they had arrived, through practical experience of the legitimate maritime world and its failures, at similar conclusions about what governance arrangements were acceptable. More directly, Ridicker argues that the pirate practices of democratic election and collective governance were a conscious inversion of the arrangements they had experienced on legitimate ships, an experiment in how a community of maritime workers might organize itself if freed from the constraints of merchant capitalism and naval hierarchy. Whether this experiment was noble or squalid depended heavily on whose perspective you adopted. From the perspective of the merchant captain who lost his cargo to a pirate raid, or the passenger who was held for ransom, or the sailor who was killed resisting capture, the pirates' democratic governance was cold comfort. From the perspective of a sailor who had spent years under a brutal captain for inadequate pay with no legal recourse, the pirate company's arrangements represented a genuine improvement in his material and political conditions. The historical reality is complex enough to accommodate both perspectives simultaneously. The transition from historical piracy to mythological piracy was accomplished primarily through the media of print culture, and it began almost immediately. Daniel Defoe's contribution to this mythology is so fundamental that it deserves special attention. A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, was the foundational text of Golden Age pirate mythology. Its portraits of Blackbeard, Roberts, Mary Read, and Anne Bonny, vivid, detailed, morally ambiguous, were the primary source from which all subsequent popular treatments drew. But Defoe, if it was indeed Defoe, which recent scholarship has questioned, had a complex relationship to his subject. He was a political and economic writer of considerable sophistication, deeply interested in the relationship between capitalism, crime, and moral order. His other major works, Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, Colonel Jack, all circle around the same questions. What is the relationship between survival, virtue, and crime? What does a person owe to a society that has treated them unjustly? How do legitimate and illegitimate commercial activities relate to each other? A general history addresses these questions through the specific lens of piracy, and the answers it offers are not simple. The pirates it portraits are not simply villains. They are people who have made comprehensible choices in a world of limited options, who have built communities with their own forms of honor and loyalty, and who meet their ends not because they were wrong to reject the world they came from, but because the world they built was ultimately unsustainable. The book was enormously popular, running through multiple editions. It entered popular culture immediately and contributed directly to the theatrical and fictional treatments of piracy that followed. By the 19th century, the figures Defoe described had been absorbed into the cultural mythology of a dozen nations. The romanticization of piracy was not simply a failure of historical understanding. It served cultural functions that genuine history was not equipped to provide. The pirate was, for a culture undergoing the traumas of industrialization and the loss of traditional forms of community and autonomy, a figure of fantasized freedom. A man who had refused the terms of the emerging capitalist order and gone to see on his own terms. That this freedom was violent, short-lived, and often cruel was part of the mythology too. The pirate's defiance was heroic precisely because it was doomed. His freedom defined by its fragility. The same romanticization that made pirates into heroes also, paradoxically, neutralized the political challenge their story might have posed. A pirate who is a romantic hero is safely contained within the narrative of individual adventurism. A pirate who is the product of systematic exploitation and a rational response to genuine injustice is potentially a more uncomfortable figure. A reminder that the economic order has always produced its own internal critics, and that those critics were sometimes right. We need, before we close, to hold the full picture, not just the pirates and the merchants and the governors, but the largest structure within which all of them operated, the Atlantic economy that produced Golden Age piracy was not only a commercial system, it was a specific form of human organization, one that depended, at its foundation, on the most extreme form of violence available, the reduction of human beings to the status of property. The slave trade was not peripheral to the story of Atlantic piracy. It was central. The ships that carried enslaved Africans were themselves targets of pirate raids. In some cases, pirates freed their captive cargo and offered the formerly enslaved people the opportunity to join the company. In other cases, pirate ships carried enslaved people as cargo, selling them in colonial markets alongside other goods. The ports that hosted pirate commerce were the same ports through which enslaved people were sold. The merchants who fenced pirate goods were often the same merchants who invested in slave ships. The golden age of Atlantic piracy and the peak of the Atlantic slave trade coincide almost exactly in time, roughly 1680 to 1730. This is not a coincidence. Both phenomena were products of the same Atlantic commercial expansion, the same labor demands of plantation agriculture, the same geographic concentration of value in the shipping lanes of the Atlantic world. The pirates who sailed those lanes occupied a morally complex position within this system. Some rejected it, offering freedom to enslaved people they encountered, building communities that were, by the standards of the time, unusually inclusive of people of African descent. Others participated in it as readily as any other commercial activity. Most fell somewhere in between. People who had no consistent ideology about slavery, whose practical decisions about the people they encountered on their voyages were shaped by immediate circumstances rather than principle. The historians who have most carefully attended to this dimension of pirate history, Ridicker most prominently, but others as well, have argued that the pirate world, at its best, represented a possible alternative to the racial and class hierarchies of the Atlantic plantation economy. The pirate ship that included free people of African descent as full members of the crew, equal in share and in governance to their white shipmates, was a glimpse of a world that the Atlantic economy was otherwise organized to prevent. That glimpse was not a revolution. The pirates did not challenge slavery as an institution. Their individual decisions about the people they encountered were inconsistent at best and brutal at worst. But the fact that their communities sometimes found ways to include people across the color line, and that those inclusions were recorded with enough specificity to survive in the historical record, is a reminder that the racial order of the early Atlantic world was not inevitable. It was constructed, enforced, and contested. And the pirates, whatever their limitations, were among those who contested it. History has a way of leaving us with questions rather than answers. And the history of piracy is particularly generous in this respect. The basic question, what separates legitimate commerce from organized theft, turns out not to have a stable, permanent answer. It turns out to be a political question, answered differently in different periods by different distributions of power, and capable of being answered again differently in the future. The states that suppressed Atlantic piracy in the 1720s were not, on the whole, more virtuous or less violent than the pirates they hanged. They were more powerful, and their power gave them the authority to define legality in ways that protected their interests. They wrote the laws, appointed the judges, commanded the navies, and controlled the historical record, including the records that would shape how subsequent generations understood what the pirates had been and what their suppression had meant. The historians who have recovered a more complex picture: Ridicker with his labor history, Lane with his structural analysis, Earl with his institutional records, Chet with his legal analysis, have done the important work of reading those records against the grain, of asking not just what the powerful said about the pirates, but what the pirates said about themselves, and what the material conditions of their world might explain about the choices they made. What they have found is a history that challenges easy moral categories. A world in which violence and commerce were thoroughly intertwined. A world in which the line between authorized and unauthorized predation was drawn by political calculation rather than moral principle. A world in which the dispossessed sometimes built remarkable communities of mutual aid and democratic self-governance on the margins of a society that had expelled them, and a world in which the suppression of those communities, the closing of the space for alternative arrangements that piracy, at its best, represented, was accomplished not in the name of ending violence, but in the name of directing it more efficiently toward the purposes of those who were already powerful. That world is not simply the past. Its structures, commercial, legal, political, are not simply historical curiosities. The questions it raises are permanently available for our consideration. Who gets to authorize violence? Who benefits from it? Who pays its costs? And when the answer to those questions is consistently the same, the powerful authorizing, benefiting, and exempting themselves from the costs, what is the appropriate response of those who find themselves on the other side of that arrangement? The pirates of the Golden Age had one answer. The historians who study them are slowly, carefully, working out what we should make of it. The public trials of Golden Age pirates were major cultural events, serving functions that went far beyond the simple adjudication of guilt and the imposition of punishment. The piracy trial was designed to communicate. It communicated the power of the state to reach even the most apparently free of criminals. The man who had sailed beyond the law's reach had been found, captured, and brought before the bar of justice. It communicated the seriousness with which the commercial interests that piracy threatened were taken by the state. The elaborate ceremonial of a major piracy trial demonstrated that the Crown considered the protection of maritime commerce a priority worth investing substantial resources in, and it communicated the specific terms on which the state's mercy was available. Through the system of pardons and amnesties that offered reprieve to those who surrendered and cooperated, the trials also served as public spectacle. They were well attended. They generated written records, published trial accounts, newspaper reports, broadsheets with the dying speeches of the condemned, that circulated widely and contributed to the public's understanding of who pirates were and what their lives had been. Captain Johnson's general history drew extensively on the published trial records of this period, and much of what we know about the internal life of Golden Age pirate companies comes from statements made at trial. The dying speeches attributed to pirates at their executions were a formal genre, a set of statements that the condemned were expected to make, in which they acknowledged their crimes, expressed repentance, and warned others against following their example. These speeches were published almost immediately after the executions and circulated widely. But the published dying speeches are a complicated source because the form was so standardized that the specific content was often produced by ministers or court officials rather than the condemned themselves. A pirate who went to the gallows cursing and defiant, which some did, according to witness accounts, would have his dying speech reconstructed for publication in a form that conformed to the expected narrative of repentance and warning. The reading public wanted condemned criminals to repent. The published record provided that repentance, whether or not it had actually occurred. The discrepancy between the published dying speeches and the reported behavior of condemned pirates at their executions is one of the more vivid illustrations of how the state constructed the meaning of piracy through its legal and cultural apparatus. The pirate, as published in official accounts, was a different creature from the pirate as experienced by those who encountered him, and the gap between the two tells us as much about the interests of those who produced the official accounts as about the actual lives of the men being described. The royal pardon offered to pirates who surrendered, first in 1717, and then extended and modified in subsequent years, was a sophisticated instrument of governance that deserves careful examination. On the surface, a pardon for pirates seems paradoxical. The state that hanged men for piracy was also offering to forgive those same men their crimes if they surrendered in time. This seems inconsistent with a simple deterrence model of criminal justice. If the state was willing to forgive pirates, why would pirates fear the law? But the pardon system was not really about forgiveness in the moral sense. It was a strategic instrument designed to divide the pirate community by offering individual pirates a path back to legitimate existence. The pardon created an incentive for surrender that competed with the incentive for continued defiance. It drove a wedge between pirates who wanted to accept the offer and pirates who preferred to continue, forcing the community to choose sides in a way that benefited the suppression campaign. The terms of the pardon were carefully calibrated to be attractive enough to induce significant surrenders, while not being so generous as to undermine the deterrent effect of piracy prosecution. Acceptance of the pardon carried with it immunity from prosecution for past acts, but required future good behavior, and crucially, cooperation with authorities in identifying former associates who had not surrendered. This cooperation requirement was perhaps the most strategically valuable element of the pardon system. Former pirates who informed on active pirates provided intelligence that was otherwise very difficult to obtain. They knew the operational patterns of pirate companies, the locations of bases and caches, the identities of shoreside supporters. This intelligence was worth, from the state's perspective, far more than the prosecution of any individual former pirate. The pardon system was not unlimited. It contained time limits. Pirates who didn't surrender by specified dates lost their eligibility. It contained exclusions. Certain notorious individuals were specifically excluded, and it came with the implicit threat that refusal would be met with intensified pursuit, and when captured, a prosecution that would be particularly vigorous. The combination of carrot and stick, generous terms for those who surrendered, credible threat of hanging for those who didn't, was more effective than either pure force or pure negotiation would have been. It exploited the divisions within the pirate community, leveraged the desire of individual pirates to exit the life before it killed them, and provided the intelligence needed to pursue those who refused. Woodes Rogers used this system with considerable sophistication at Nassau in 1718. His arrival with a naval force and a royal proclamation created a fork in the road for the Nassau pirates. Surrender now on generous terms, or prepare to be hunted down. The response was mixed. Many surrendered, some fled, and a few resisted openly. Rogers hanged those who resisted with theatrical promptness and displayed their bodies prominently, reinforcing the message for those who were still undecided. The suppression of the Atlantic Golden Age did not, as we've noted, end piracy, but it did substantially change the character and scale of maritime violence in the Atlantic world. The post-Golden Age period saw the continuation of piracy at reduced scale, smaller operations, less organized, operating in the margins of the increasingly well-patrolled Atlantic sea lanes. These later pirates lacked the organizational sophistication of the Golden Age companies, the shoreside support networks, and the cultural resonance. They were criminals in a more straightforward sense than their predecessors. Without the labor history context, without the democratic governance experiments, without the moral framework that had given the Golden Age pirates some claim to the sympathy of the dispossessed. This change in character was itself a product of the suppression campaign. The Golden Age pirates had flourished in an environment of weak or tolerant governance, sympathetic port communities, and a labor market that drove men from legitimate service into piracy as a rational alternative. The suppression campaign changed all three of these conditions, strengthening governance, ending official tolerance, and improving somewhat the conditions of legitimate maritime labor. Though the improvements were modest and gradual, The men who turned to piracy in the later 18th century were operating in a more hostile environment with fewer options for maintaining the kind of community and organizational structure that had characterized the Golden Age. They were also, as a result, more desperate and often more brutal in their operations. Without the organizational capacity to take prizes strategically and manage the aftermath in ways that minimized resistance, they tended toward approaches that were less commercially rational and more violently direct. The distinction between the organized, constitutionally governed Golden Age company and the desperate individual pirate or small gang of the later period is a distinction between forms of social organization as much as forms of crime. The Golden Age piracy was possible because its practitioners had built genuine communities with real institutional capacity. When those communities were destroyed through execution, through pardon and dispersal, through the elimination of the shoreside support networks, what remained was a cruder and less interesting form of maritime violence. We've mentioned the scholars whose work informs this story: Whittaker, Lane, Earl, Pennell, Chet, but it's worth spending a moment on the question of why the history of piracy has attracted such serious and sophisticated scholarship. The obvious answer is that pirates are interesting. The Golden Age figures are vivid. The stories are dramatic. The setting is romantically compelling. Maritime history has always attracted a particular kind of reader. People who are drawn to the sea, to the challenge of surviving in hostile environments, to the specific combination of technical skill and physical courage that the age of sail required. But the more important answer is that piracy is a window. It is a window into the social history of the maritime working class. The men and occasional women who did the physical work of the Atlantic economy, but left few direct records of their experience. The trial documents, the pirate articles, the accounts of captured sailors. These are almost the only historical sources that give us direct access to the voices of people who were otherwise excluded from the historical record. Whittaker's method, reading the records of piracy prosecution against the grain, attending to what the defendants and witnesses reveal about the conditions of their lives, is a model for how to do social history with limited sources. The approach has influenced not just the history of piracy, but the broader field of Atlantic labor history, contributing to a much richer understanding of how the Atlantic economy worked at the level of individual experience, rather than aggregate commercial statistics. The history of piracy also illuminates the history of law. Specifically, the history of how law is used to define and enforce commercial order. The anti-piracy legal architecture of the early 18th century, as Guy Chet shows, was not a neutral application of universal principles. It was a political instrument crafted to serve specific interests, and the questions it raises about who law protects and against whom it is deployed are permanently relevant, and the history of piracy illuminates, above all, the history of capitalism in its early phases, the relationship between commerce, violence, and state power in the period when the structures of the modern commercial world were being built. Understanding that relationship is not just an academic exercise. It is a contribution to the ongoing human project of understanding what we have built, how we built it, and whether the structures we live with are as inevitable and as permanent as they sometimes appear to be. The scholars who have done this work, who have gone into the archives, assembled the fragments, and reconstructed the world of the Golden Age pirates with rigor and imagination, have given us something more than an interesting story. They have given us a tool for thinking about the world we live in, and for asking the questions that the official version of that world tends to discourage. There is something fitting about exploring this history in the dark hours, in the quiet between day's end and the first light of morning. The sea that the Golden Age pirates sailed was, for most of its hours, dark and quiet. The great Atlantic voyages, the crossing from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean, the passage from West Africa to the American coast, the long beat up the eastern seaboard against contrary winds, were conducted mostly in silence, punctuated by the creak of rigging, the slap of water against the hull, and the calls of watch officers marking the passing of the night. The men who sailed in those hours lived with a particular kind of awareness, an awareness of their own smallness against the scale of the ocean, of the fragility of the wooden vessel beneath them, of the distance between themselves and any help if things went wrong. That awareness produced, in some men, a kind of fatalism, the acceptance that death was always near, that the best one could do was sail carefully and die well. In others, it produced the defiant spirit of the Golden Age pirate. Since death was always near anyway, why not live fully and freely in whatever time remained? Black Sam Bellamy, who died when his ship Witta was wrecked in a storm off Cape Cod in April 1717, taking nearly all of his crew with him, was 28 years old. Bartholomew Roberts died at 37. Edward Teach Blackbeard was probably in his late 30s when a Virginia naval expedition found him in Ocracoke Inlet and killed him in a boarding action. These were young men, living at the speed of the life they had chosen, spending their time as they saw fit before the sea or the gallows claimed it. There is something in their stories, not in their violence, not in their crimes, but in the specific quality of their defiance. That speaks to something permanent in the human condition, the refusal to accept the terms that power offers, the insistence that there must be something better than what the world is proposing, the willingness to pay the price of that insistence, even when the price is very high. We don't have to admire the pirates to find their story worth telling. We just have to be honest about what it reveals. About the world they lived in, about the choices they made, and about the structures that made those choices feel necessary. The ocean doesn't keep their secrets. The waves that washed over the Whydah and carried 300 men to their deaths also, eventually, gave the ship back to the shore, where it was found by archaeologists in the 1980s. Its bells and guns and personal effects telling the story of its last night to anyone willing to listen. We are still listening. Before we close tonight, I want to say something about why this history matters in a way that goes beyond academic interest. The men and women of the Golden Age were not saints. They committed acts of violence, theft, and cruelty that cannot be minimized or excused. The merchant captains they killed, the passengers they terrorized, the sailors they forced into their companies at the point of a cutlass. All of these were real people who suffered real harm at the hands of people who had chosen a life outside the law's protection. And yet, when we sit with the full context, the brutal labor conditions that produced the Golden Age pirates, the commercial systems built on slavery and coerced labor that constituted the legitimate world they had rejected, the financial networks of respectable merchants and colonial governors who profited from their crimes while condemning them publicly. The simple moral calculus breaks down. History is not a trial in which we deliver verdicts. It is an attempt at understanding, at grasping why people in specific circumstances made the choices they did, and what those choices reveal about the world that shaped them. What the Golden Age pirates reveal about their world is uncomfortable. It is a world in which the line between crime and commerce was drawn by power, not by principle. A world in which the law protected the already powerful from the violence of the dispossessed, while providing no comparable protection to the dispossessed against the violence of the powerful. A world that created, through its labor systems and its commercial structures, a large population of people with skills, grievances, and nothing to lose. That population made choices. Those choices led to violence, yes, but they also led, in some of the most remarkable cases, to the construction of communities of a different kind. Communities organized around principles of collective governance, mutual obligation, and shared risk that were, in important respects, more equitable than anything the legitimate world offered their members. We honor those communities not by pretending that the pirates were heroes, but by taking seriously what they were trying to build, and by asking honestly what it tells us about the world that made them feel they had no other choice. History has a way of asking the hardest questions with the softest voice, whispering them in the dark, between the facts and the names and the dates, in the spaces where the real meaning lives. The sea outside is quiet tonight. The ships are sleeping in their harbors. And somewhere, in the long record of human time, a man with salt water in his beard is deciding which flag to fly in the morning. His choice will depend on what the world has offered him. It always does. In the summer of 1984, a marine archaeologist named Barry Clifford found the wreck of the Witta Galley in 30 feet of water off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The ship had sunk in April 1717 during a violent nor'easter, taking most of Sam Bellamy's crew, 143 men, to the bottom. The Witta had been a slave ship before Bellamy took it as a prize and made it his flagship. The name from Ouidah, a port on the slave coast of West Africa, carried within it the history of the Atlantic slave trade, the same trade that the pirates of the Golden Age had complex and often troubling relationships with. What Clifford found beneath the sand was extraordinary. The ship had preserved in its wreckage an unprecedented archive of Golden Age piracy. Weapons and tools, personal belongings, coins from a dozen different nations, navigational instruments, medical equipment, and most movingly, the small objects that had belonged to individual crew members. A silk stocking stuffed with gold dust, a fastener engraved with initials, a child's shoe that might have belonged to a boy who ran away to sea. These objects are, in their way, a form of testimony. They speak not to the romance of piracy, not to the adventure stories and the skull and crossbones flags, but to the reality of specific human lives ended on a specific night in a storm off a specific cape. Young men who had made choices and lived by those choices and died in the consequence of them. Their possessions scattered in the sand for 2.5 centuries before the sea gave them back. The bell of the Witta, recovered from the wreck, is inscribed with the date 1716, the year the ship was built, and the words the Witta, Gally. It is the only authenticated artifact from a Golden Age pirate ship so far discovered, and it sits in the Witta Pirate Museum in Provincetown, Massachusetts, at the very tip of Cape Cod, within sight of the waters where the ship went down. It is, among other things, an object of grief, a memorial to people who have been turned into legend, but who were, before that, people with fears and hopes and the peculiar specific weight of an individual life. History remembers the famous ones: Blackbeard for his theatrical terror, Bartholomew Roberts for his extraordinary success, Bellamy for his speech about the rich men's laws. But the Witta's crew of 143 were not all famous. Most of them are names in a court document, a record of the dead that the ship's sinking produced. Their stories are not recoverable in any detail. We know they existed, and we know they died, and we know something about the world that made them who they were. That is sometimes all that history can give us. It is, when we receive it honestly, enough to make the story real. The bell rings its year on the Cape Cod shore. And the sea that took those men is still out there, patient and unchanged, keeping whatever other secrets it holds from days we will never fully know. As our journey tonight comes quietly to an end, let the story settle in your mind like distant waves rolling onto a quiet shore. The pirates we followed have long since vanished from the oceans of the world. Their ships are gone, their flags lowered to history, but the great rivers of trade that shaped their lives still move silently across the seas tonight. Somewhere far out in the darkness, ships are still crossing ancient waters, following routes first carved by sailors centuries ago. They carry cargo, stories, and the faint echoes of countless human dreams that once sailed these same horizons. And now, the sea grows calm again. There is nothing left to chase, nothing left to seize. Only the slow rhythm of the water and the quiet drift of history moving gently through the night. This has been the Sleep Code Historian. Thank you for spending part of your night with me. Sleep well and good night.